My name is Cale Whitmore. And before I tell you what happened, before I tell you what I saw when I opened my eyes in that place, I need you to understand who I was before. Because the before matters. It always matters. Every story that starts with a man waking up somewhere wrong, somewhere impossible, starts with who that man was when he was still somewhere right. I was 34. I worked environmental restoration for a mid-tier contracted firm out of what used to be called Oregon. We didn't call it that anymore. The coastal zones had been renamed after the 2041 flooding treaties, administrative restructuring, the usual bureaucratic fog that follows catastrophe. But I still called it Oregon in my head because that's where I grew up, and some things you carry in your language even when the maps change. I was good at my job, not brilliant, not the kind of guy who gets written up in the industry newsletters, but steady. The kind of technician who shows up at 600 when the weather is ugly and the equipment is questionable and the site manager is having a breakdown and just works. I could read soil moisture data the way some people read novels. I understood erosion patterns the way other guys understood football statistics. It wasn't glamorous. My hands were always dirty. My knees hurt from crouching over sample plots. I ate lunch out of a dented thermos most days, sitting on whatever rock or fallen tree was nearby, watching the slow argument between damaged land and the organisms trying to heal it. I didn't have a family. That's not a tragic thing, it's just true. My parents were gone, the way most parents in their 70s were gone by 2048. My sister lived in what used to be Manitoba, and we called each other on her birthday and mine, and we meant to visit more, but we never did. I had a small apartment in a housing collective outside what was technically still called Portland. I had a neighbor named Dov who played guitar badly, but with tremendous enthusiasm every Thursday evening. I had a cat named Stonefish who was mean to everyone except me. That was my life, that was the before. The last thing I remember from that before is a survey site, team of 4 including me. We were running atmospheric samples at a reclamation zone about 40 kilometers inland from the old coastline, a stretch of territory that had been submerged, drained, left to regenerate, and was now being assessed for secondary restoration potential. It was late afternoon. The light was doing that specific thing it does in early autumn in the Pacific Northwest, going golden and a little melancholy, like it knows it's losing ground to the dark. I remember crouching over the sample kit. I remember Patricia Vance, our team lead, saying something about the Northwest Quadrant readings being off. I remember turning to look at her, noticing she was shielding her eyes against the light, looking at something in the sky. I remember looking up. And then, nothing. The corridor between is not a metaphor. I'm telling you it's a real thing. I spent time there, genuine, measurable time, I think, though I have no way to verify it. It wasn't unconsciousness the way you go under anesthesia, that clean black switch off. It was more like being preserved in something, like the way you'd pack a fragile object for a very long shipment. Surrounded, padded, protected from any contact with the world that might damage you. I dreamed, or something like dreaming. I saw Oregon, real Oregon, the way it used to be, trees that were 3 meters wide at the base, rivers so clear you could read the individual stones on the bottom. I saw my mother in her kitchen, her hands in bread dough. I saw Stonefish sitting on a windowsill, his tail doing that slow predatory twitch at a bird he'd never catch. I was not afraid in the corridor. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I should have been terrified, I should have been screaming into the dark. But whatever the corridor was, it did something to the fear. Not removed it, more like put it on pause. Set it aside gently, like someone placing a glass down carefully so it doesn't shatter. And then I woke up. The first sensation was cold air. Not brutal cold, not the cold of exposure or danger, but the cool, slightly recycled quality of air that has been filtered many times. Climate-controlled air. The kind that has no smell of earth or weather in it at all. The second sensation was the surface beneath me, firm with slight give, not uncomfortable, not a field, not a floor, not the ground, something designed for a body to lie on. The third sensation was light, indirect, sourceless, very slightly blue-white, the color of overcast sky at noon without any warmth in it. I lay there for what might have been 30 seconds, just collecting these sensations, letting them arrive one at a time. My brain was doing what brains do when reality presents them with something for which they have no existing template. It was stalling. It was running comparisons against every stored image of waking up in an unfamiliar place that I had in my experience hospital, field tent, friend's couch after a long night, and finding none of them a match, and therefore choosing, very reasonably, to simply not process yet, to just receive. Then I turned my head. The ceiling was high, much higher than any room I'd ever been in, not in a cathedral, dramatic way, but in a functional, utilitarian way, like a space designed for equipment rather than atmosphere. The walls curved slightly at the upper edges, meeting the ceiling in a smooth radius rather than a sharp corner. The material was, I don't have a word for it. It was not metal, not composite, not anything in my material vocabulary. It had a quality like stone that had been convinced to behave differently. Dense and still and faintly warm in color despite the cool light. I sat up. There were others in the room. Let me tell you about the room first, before I tell you about the others, because the room matters and I want to get this right. It was large enough that the far wall was at a distance that required my eyes to focus differently to bring it into clarity, maybe 40 meters, maybe more. The floor was level and appeared seamless, the same material as the walls, slightly darker in shade. Along the walls at regular intervals there were structures I didn't have immediate names for, not quite shelves, not quite consoles, not quite furniture. Objects of clearly functional purpose whose function I could not identify. Some had surfaces that glowed with slow, patient pulses of light in colors I associated with status indicators, green adjacent, amber adjacent, occasionally something in the deep blue range. The ceiling had what I can only describe as light panels, though they didn't look like any light panel I'd ever seen. They weren't flush or recessed. They were more like sections of the ceiling that had simply decided to be luminous. No fixture, no hardware, no boundary where the light stopped. It just was. There were passages leading out of the room, at least 3 visible from where I sat. They were arched, smooth-edged, dark beyond the first meter or two where the corridor light apparently began somewhere further in. The air moved, not like ventilation, not that specific pushing quality of climate control. More like the air itself was being gently exchanged, a whole-room process rather than a directed one. It was, in every detail, a room that no human being had designed. And that was where I woke up. Now the others. There were 11 of them in the room when I sat up. Every single one of them was looking at me. I want you to feel that for a second. The specific quality of that moment. 11 sets of eyes already focused, already waiting, as if the act of me sitting up had been something they'd been anticipating, not with alarm, not with aggression, but with an attention so complete and total that it felt almost like weight. Like the attention itself had a physical presence. My first assessment, and I want to be honest here, I want to tell you exactly what my brain did before it caught up with the impossibility of what I was seeing. My first assessment was human. That was my first read. Because they had the right shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, faces with features in the expected positions. Hair, eyes. Something recognizable in their general architectural proportion that said person to the deep, old parts of my brain that do that sorting before the thinking parts even get involved. But then the thinking parts got involved. The height was wrong first. Not dramatically wrong, not science fiction movie alien wrong, but wrong in the way that a measurement you expected to be 6 is instead 8. They were tall. Not uniformly tall, but the range that I could observe put the shortest of them at what I estimated to be roughly 2.1 meters, and the tallest at something closer to 2.4. Tall and proportioned in a way that wasn't just stretched out human. There was something in the ratio of limb to torso, shoulder width to hip, that was slightly off from the human version. Like a sculptor had worked from a description of humanity rather than from observation. Their skin, I keep coming back to their skin because it was the detail that most defied immediate categorization. The range of tone was different from human range, not different in the way human variation is different, which is a beautiful spectrum of melanin and undertone. This was different in a way that suggested entirely other pigmentation systems. I saw someone with what I can only describe as a very faint iridescence to their complexion, like the surface of certain beetles. I saw someone else whose skin had a quality of depth to it, not translucent exactly, but as though the color existed slightly below the surface rather than on it. Another had a coloring in the gray-lavender range that I'd never seen on any person from Earth. Their eyes were largest departure from human, not in shape, the shape was close enough, but in the iris. Large, very large relative to the sclera, taking up significantly more of the visible eye surface than human irises do. and the color range went places human eyes don't. A deep gold that was genuinely golden, not the honey-brown humans call gold. A true violet. Something in the spectrum between green and gray that seemed to shift slightly as the head turned and the light angle changed. 11 of them. All women. All looking at me. I said the word, out loud, the way humans do when faced with a category error that their brain cannot quietly absorb. What? Not a question, not really. More like a sound, like the audible result of processing failing. One of them moved. She was closest to me, maybe 4 meters away, standing near one of the unidentifiable wall structures. She was on the shorter end of the group's range, which still put her at around 2.1 meters, and she had hair that was a very dark auburn, almost brown in the low light, cut close on the sides with more length on top, pushed back from her face. Her eyes were that genuine gold I mentioned. Her skin had the slightly deeper pigmentation characteristic, and an undertone I couldn't quite place, warm but not human warm. She held her hands up, palms out. I recognized that gesture. It translated. The recognition of that, the fact that I had a shared gesture with something that was not from my planet, landed somewhere behind my sternum with a kind of impact that wasn't pain and wasn't comfort and was maybe something between. She said something. It wasn't a language I knew, obviously. It was, and I'm going to try to describe this accurately rather than poetically, it had a quality of being engineered for clarity. Evenly spaced sounds. Nothing aspirated or clicked that my vocal anatomy would struggle with. It felt like a language that had been designed with multiple species in mind. I stared at her. She waited, then she tried something else, a different cadence, same quality. I stared. Third attempt, and this time there was a word in it I recognized. It was embedded in the alien phonology and slightly accented but unmistakable. Slow. She was telling me to take it slow. I took a breath. Somewhere behind me, someone was already moving toward me from a different direction. I heard it in my peripheral awareness, and I turned fast because that's an instinct that doesn't care how disoriented you are. There was another woman, taller, maybe 2.3 meters. Her hair was white, genuinely white, not aged white, naturally white the way snow is white and very long, pulled over one shoulder. Her eyes were that shifting gray-green. She stopped when I turned. She'd been holding something, a flat object, roughly tablet-sized, and she extended it toward me very deliberately, showing me she was offering it, not threatening with it. On its surface, text was assembling itself. English text. I need to pause here and tell you what that did to me, seeing English on that surface. Because you'd think the logical response to seeing your own language appear on a device in an alien facility would be relief. Some form of relief, connection, the comfort of something familiar in completely unfamiliar territory. That's not what it did. What it actually did was make everything more frightening, not less. Because familiar things that appear in wrong contexts are terrifying in a way that the purely alien isn't. The purely alien gives you distance. You can put it in a category unknown, external, not mine, but familiar things in wrong contexts take that distance away. They say, we know about you, we've studied you, we were prepared for you. We were waiting for you. The text on the surface said, please do not be afraid, you are safe. This facility is protected, we will explain everything, can you read this? I read it twice. I was aware of all 11 of them watching me read it. That awareness was an additional layer of strangeness, the sense of being observed while processing something that required all of your attention. I looked up at the white-haired woman. I said yes. Something moved across her face. I want to tell you it was relief, but honestly I'm not sure I had the context to read alien facial expressions accurately yet. It was something, though. A shift in the tension of her features that suggested the answer mattered. She typed, or whatever the gesture equivalent was on that device, touching it in a sequence, and new text appeared. Your name is Cale Whitmore. You were born in a place called Cottage Grove, in a region of your planet called Oregon. You are 34 years old. You are a terrestrial restoration technician. You were retrieved from survey coordinates in the Pacific Northwest Zone on the date your people mark as October 14, 2048. I read it. I read it again. I said retrieved. More text, fast, like whoever was operating this was anticipating the questions. Retrieved is the closest word we have in your language for what occurred. You were not harmed in the retrieval. The process was designed to preserve biological and neurological integrity. You have been in a state of maintained suspension for a period of approximately 8 months by your calendar. 8 months. 8 months. I put my hand over my mouth. Not a dramatic gesture, just something my body did before my thinking self had any input. The way you put your hand over your mouth when someone tells you something that your whole body needs a second to absorb. 8 months. Stonefish would be with someone else now, or gone. Dov had probably spent 3 Thursdays wondering where I was before life continued in its way. Pris. I thought of Pris shielding her eyes against the autumn light, watching the sky. Pris, what had happened to her, what had happened to the team. The members of your survey team were not harmed. They did not witness the retrieval. This is standard protocol. I looked up sharply. The device had answered a question I hadn't asked yet. Did you read that off my face? I said. The white-haired woman, and I will tell you her name soon. I'll tell you all their names as I learned them. But for now, she was still the white-haired woman. She did something that might, in the right light, have been a small, careful smile. She typed. Your expression was consistent with the concern we expected. We did not read your thoughts. We are not capable of that. We simply knew the question would come. Chapter 2, 11 NAMES. The next hour was the most information-dense hour of my life, and I've had some dense ones. Field briefings before major restoration operations. The week my company briefed us on the new atmospheric protocols, and there were 4 days of technical sessions. My graduate environmental science coursework during the period, we covered ocean acidification cascades. None of that prepared me for what I received in that room. From 11 aliens who watched me the way you watch someone very carefully, when you need them to understand something, and you're not entirely sure your communication method is up to the task. The facility was underground. Not deep underground. I learned later it was approximately 200 meters below the surface, which sounds deep until you understand the depth is partly intentional concealment and partly the structural requirements of the technology it housed. It was on Earth. Also underground in what had been British Columbia, in a geological formation that provided both the stability and the isolation the facility needed. They called it a transition station. Not a base, not a headquarters, not a ship, a station specifically designed for a specific purpose, and that purpose was exactly what it sounds like. Transition, the moving of something from one state to another. They were called the Veil. That wasn't a word for their species exactly. It was closer to what I'd call a clade, a broad grouping of several related species from a cluster of star systems that had been in contact with each other for, and I want to give you accurate numbers here, the numbers they gave me, approximately 4,000 of their years, which didn't directly translate to Earth years, but was in that general magnitude. 4,000 years of contact, cooperation, trade, and occasional conflict, settling into something that functioned at a civilizational scale. They had known about Earth for a long time, longer than I was comfortable hearing about. They had had a policy about Earth for a long time too, a non-interference protocol, which sounds familiar because apparently independently arising civilizations keep landing on similar ethical frameworks when they get sophisticated enough and guilty enough about their own history of contact. Leave the developing ones alone. Let them get there on their own. Watch from a distance, gather data, but no contact, no interference, no retrieval. That protocol had changed. The reason the protocol had changed is the part that took me the longest to hear. It's the part I'm going to spend the most time on because it's the part that, even now, even having had time to sit with it, even now it's the part that hits differently every time I come back to it. I'll tell it to you the way it was told to me, which was in pieces, over the course of that first hour and then the hours after it, because they were calibrating how much I could absorb at once, and I was calibrating the same thing from my end. And we were all, essentially, doing the very human, and apparently the very universal thing of feeling our way through something unprecedented. The Veil had been tracking a specific phenomenon. A demographic collapse, they called it, though the translation was imprecise, and the concept was slightly different from how we use that phrase. They weren't tracking population numbers. They were tracking genetic diversity at the chromosomal level, across multiple species simultaneously. This was apparently a standard piece of their long-range civilization health monitoring, The kind of thing you start doing when you've been a spacefaring culture long enough to see civilizations fail from the inside out. What they'd been watching in the human species for approximately 40 years of Earth time was a contraction, a narrowing. I won't go into the technical details they gave me because A, I'm not a geneticist, and my understanding of the mechanism is imperfect, and B, this story is hard enough to tell without turning it into a biology lecture. But the simplified version is this. Human males, the Y chromosome. Something had been happening to it. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, not in a way that human science hadn't been aware of. In fact, human science had been tracking the slow genetic erosion of the Y chromosome for decades, and had mostly concluded it was a long timeline problem, the kind of thing measured in geological time rather than human history time. The Veil's data suggested the timeline was not geological. Their models, and they had models built on 4,000 years of multi-species demographic observation. Their models said the timeline was shorter, much shorter, and that a threshold had been passed, or was being passed, in which the rate of change was no longer slow and predictable, but was entering a period of acceleration. They had been watching this happen, and their protocol said don't interfere. And then someone in their council had made an argument, a very specific argument, by a scientist whose name I was given, and whose name I will not try to reproduce here because I cannot accurately transliterate it, but who was apparently, from everything I understand, the reason I am alive and here and able to tell you this story. This scientist had made the argument that there was a distinction between interfering with a developing civilization's cultural or technological trajectory, which was the core of the non-interference protocol, and intervening to prevent a genetic catastrophe, which was something else entirely. Something more like the moral obligation of anyone who sees a person drowning, regardless of what language the drowning person speaks. The argument had been debated. For approximately 3 of their years it had been debated. I try to imagine that debate, the scope of it, the weight of it, the different voices and positions and stakes involved, and I can't. Not really. I can make a sketch of it in my mind, but it's a rough sketch, the way a child's drawing of a cathedral is a rough sketch. The argument won, narrowly, but it won. And so the protocol changed, and the transition stations were built, and the retrieval operations began. And I woke up in British Columbia, 200 meters underground, in a room with 11 women who had been waiting for me. Now let me tell you about the 11. Their names as I learned them, as I learned to say them. And I want to say that learning to say their names was its own weeks-long process. A daily small achievement that mattered more than it probably should have, because names are a kind of territory, and being able to call someone by their name is a way of saying, I am here, I am real, I am trying. The white-haired woman, the one with the translation device, was Siren Volteth. She was what they called a coordinator. Her function in the facility was communication and acclimation. She was the one whose specific job was to help newly retrieved humans orient themselves. She'd been doing it for approximately 2 of their years. She'd helped acclimate 14 humans before me. She was precise and patient, and had a quality of stillness about her that I came to understand was not coldness, but something more like deep competence. The stillness of someone who has learned to wait well. The gold-eyed woman who'd first held her palms up to me was Dara. Just Dara, she explained, through Siren's translation, that her full name was in a format that didn't simplify well into human phonology, and she preferred the shortened version for interaction with human facility residents. She was a physician. Not a human physician. Her training was in multi-species medicine, which apparently was a specialty in the Veil system, and she'd been studying human biology specifically for approximately 18 months of Earth time before being stationed here. She was going to be responsible for my physical health assessments. She smiled more than Siren did. The smile looked almost exactly like a human smile, which I found simultaneously comforting and destabilizing. The others I'll give you in briefer strokes, because I'm going to come back to them in detail as the story develops. Miv, who was the facility's technical engineer, responsible for all the systems that kept the underground station functioning. She barely looked at me that first day. Not hostility, just disinterest. The way some people are, the work was more interesting to her than the new person, and I respected that immediately. She was the tallest of the group. She had dark skin with that depth quality I mentioned and very short hair, and an expression of permanent low-level concentration that made me think of the best engineers I'd worked with in my career. Assel, who was some kind of analyst, I didn't fully understand her function for a while. She studied things, patterns. She had a lot of questions, but she asked them through Siren initially, careful and methodical, and she was taking notes on a device she carried everywhere, in a format I couldn't read. Reva, who was security. This is where it gets interesting, and I need to spend a moment. Reva was the one I'd noticed moving behind me in those first disorienting seconds. She was broad-shouldered even by their standards, carried herself with the specific weight of someone trained in physical response, and her eyes, that shifting violet I mentioned, were the kind of eyes that are always doing a room assessment, always reading exits and positions and threat angles. I recognized the habit because I'd worked on enough unstable field sites to know what perpetual environmental alertness looks like. She wasn't aggressive toward me, but she was watchful. And I understood, without needing it translated, that her being watchful was part of the facility's safety plan, and that it included watching me. Fen, who was the youngest of the group by their age reckoning, something like 23 in rough Earth year equivalents. She was also the most openly curious about me in a way that was almost endearing. She'd lean forward when I was being spoken to, like she was physically trying to get closer to the information. She had an enormous amount of energy, and I could tell that her stillness during that first hour was a conscious effort. Lyre, Peth, Kasha, Mal, and Vorn made up the remaining 5. I'll tell you more about them as we go. Lyre was the one who stayed furthest back for the longest time, careful, observant, choosing where she positioned herself with thought. Peth was gregarious and expressive in ways that didn't require translation. She communicated clearly with facial expression and gesture, which is a gift. Kasha had a precision about her physical movements that I later learned was a cultural marker from her specific species of origin, not a personality trait. Mal was quiet in a way that felt like density, not absence, but weight. Vorn was older than the others, I thought, or at least carried an older quality, something in the economy of her movements, the way she observed without obvious reaction. 11 women, 11 non-human women, all assigned to this facility, all here for a specific purpose that I was still in the process of understanding. Chapter 3, The Mechanics of Impossible. By the end of the first day, and I was tracking days because Siren had explained the facility's light cycle, which was calibrated to approximate an Earth day-night rhythm for the benefit of human residents. By the end of the first day, I had a basic picture of what was happening. The facility was one of approximately 40 transition stations positioned on or near Earth, distributed across geological stable zones, avoiding human-populated territories. They were there to support what the Veil called the Preservation Initiative, which was the official designation for the program that had begun following the change in non-interference protocol. The initiative had several components. There was a scientific component, ongoing study of human genetics, the specific chromosomal research that had triggered the protocol change in the first place. There was a logistical component, the retrieval operations, which were conducted with what Siren carefully described as full ethical constraints, meaning retrieved individuals were selected based on specific biological criteria rather than random, and the retrieval process was designed to minimize disruption both to the individual and to the community around them. I asked what the ethical constraints were. Siren was quiet for a moment, a thoughtful quiet, not an evasive one. Then the text on the device said, "Retrieved individuals must be biologically viable for the specific genetic purpose of the initiative. They must have no immediate dependents, no children, no partners who rely on them for survival. Their disappearance must not cause direct, irreplaceable harm to others. These criteria are deeply imperfect, and we know this. Every retrieved individual represents a failure of a better solution that we have not yet found." I sat with that for a moment. The honesty of it surprised me. I'd been braced, I realized, for something more official, more deflecting. "How many have you retrieved?" I asked. "In total, across all stations, approximately 400. 400. All meant? All biologically male humans, yes. The genetic component of the initiative focuses on the Y chromosome lineage. There are other components we can discuss when you are ready. And the women here?" I gestured at the room, at the 11 of them who were variously engaged in tasks, monitoring, waiting. "What is their role exactly? Are they—" I stopped. I wasn't sure how to phrase the question I was actually asking. Siren watched me not finish the sentence, Then she typed. Their roles are varied. Dara is your physician. Miv maintains the facility. Assel studies human culture and adaptation patterns. Reva maintains facility security. Fen and Lyre are in their professional training period, placed here as part of their certifications. The others have specific functions I will explain in detail over the coming days. She paused, then more text appeared. But I understand the question you did not finish. You want to know if their presence here is connected to you specifically, to human males specifically, in a way that is more personal than professional. I waited. The answer is nuanced, and I think it would be better told over time rather than all at once. What I can tell you now is that everything in this facility is here for a reason, and you are not in danger, and we do not own you, and you are free to refuse anything. That last part, you are free to refuse anything, landed with its own particular weight. The room they'd assigned me was small but not oppressive. Same material as the rest of the facility, same cool light, but someone had made efforts. There was a surface at the right height for a human to use as a bed, firmer than I'd have chosen but not uncomfortable. There was something that functioned as a chair. There was a narrow door to a hygiene space, and the hygiene technology took me about 20 minutes to figure out but functioned cleanly once I did. What someone had placed on the small surface I'll call a nightstand, the human word approximates the function. What someone had placed there was a mug, an actual ceramic mug, a human-made one, white with a small blue pattern of leaves around the rim, and in it, something warm that smelled unmistakably like tea. I sat down on the edge of the bed surface and held the mug in both hands. It was very slightly too full. Someone had been careful about the tea and then slightly too enthusiastic about the amount. I noticed that detail specifically because it felt human, not the tea itself, not the mug, but that small excess of carefulness. I drank it. It was not quite the right tea. There was an herbal component I didn't recognize, something floral and very slightly resinous. But it was warm and it was there, and somebody had put it there for me. I cried for about 4 minutes. Not performatively, quietly, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room 200 meters under British Columbia, holding a mug of not quite right tea. 4 minutes of the kind of crying that doesn't have a specific emotional source. It's just where the accumulation goes when it finally finds an exit. Then I drank the rest of the tea and lay down on the firm surface and let the cool, recycled air do what it was going to do. And I slept without dreaming for the first time in 8 months. Chapter 4, The Weight of Being Chosen. The second day was calmer. Calmer is relative, obviously. I was still in an alien underground facility, still living an entirely unprecedented human experience, still processing information that had no frame in anything I'd been trained for, but calmer relative to waking up surrounded by 11 non-human women whose language I didn't speak and whose faces I couldn't fully read. Dara came to my room in the morning, or what the facility called morning. The lights shifted to a warmer, slightly brighter quality that approximated dawn, and that shift was what had woken me. She had the translation device with her and a kit of some kind, and she communicated through the device that she'd like to conduct a physical assessment if I was willing. I said yes. The assessment took about 2 hours. I won't describe all of it. Some of it was frankly pretty standard compared to any thorough physical examination. Some of it used equipment I'd never seen and felt strange in ways I don't have precise language for. But Dara was careful throughout. Careful in a way that I think she'd specifically trained to be, because I got the sense more than once that her instincts were for efficiency and speed, and she was consciously moderating them for my comfort. When something was going to be unfamiliar, she showed me what she was going to do before she did it. She waited for my nod. When it was done, she sat across from me, pulled what I assumed functioned as a stool to a height that put her face roughly level with mine, which was a deliberate choice in a being who was 210 centimeters tall, and she typed a summary. You are in good physical condition. The suspension process was well tolerated. There are no neurological anomalies. Your cellular markers are consistent with our models of a healthy male human in your age range. You may experience some temporal disorientation over the coming weeks. This is normal and not a cause for medical concern. You should eat regularly and drink more water than you might think you need. I looked at the last line. The water thing is the same everywhere, I guess. She tilted her head. I couldn't tell if she understood. Then she typed, I do not understand the joke, but I understand from your tone that it was a small one. Everywhere I've ever been, someone's told me to drink more water. There was a pause while she apparently processed this through a cultural reference framework she was still building. Then, hydration is functionally critical and consistently underestimated by human males specifically. The science is the same here as in your medical tradition. So you're telling me to drink more water? I am telling you to drink more water. I laughed. She watched me laugh, that careful, calibrating watch that all of them did when I had an emotional response, collecting data, building comprehension. But there was also something in her face that I was beginning to tentatively identify as warmth. Something that suggested she was not merely observing but participating in her own way. Siren found me in the passage between my room and the larger common space that first afternoon. She was waiting outside my door, which I was beginning to understand was her version of knocking, since the rooms didn't have locks, and she'd apparently decided waiting in the corridor was the appropriate protocol. She had the device, and she was wearing what I can only describe as a look of prepared patience, the look of someone who has thought about what they're going to say and how they're going to say it, and is ready for the conversation to not go the way they planned. She typed, "There are things I should tell you today, things I have been thinking about how to tell you since before you arrived." I said, "Okay." The Preservation Initiative is not just a scientific program. In its larger scope, beyond the genetics, beyond the research, it is a population program. The Vale Council authorized it because the genetic data indicated what it indicated about the human male Y chromosome, yes. But the practical implication of that data, extended forward through the models, is a scenario in which human males become rare, and then rarer, and then. She stopped typing, started again. I want to be careful about how I explain this because there are many things wrapped together in it, and I do not want to give you the wrong shape of the thing. Take your time, I said. The retrieved males are not prisoners. They are not specimens. They are not being held here against their will. Every individual has been presented with this explanation and has been given the option to return. Some have chosen to return. The process of return is possible, but it is difficult, and it requires a period of memory adjustment that I can explain if you want that option. And the ones who didn't choose to return. They remain in the facilities. They have roles here. They contribute to the initiative in ways they choose to contribute. Some have become involved in the cultural documentation work, preserving human languages, histories, art forms, music, technical knowledge. Some work alongside the Vale scientists on the genetic research itself. Some have formed relationships. That word, relationships, it sat in the air between us, between me and the translation device and Siren Volteth with her white hair and her measured patience, and it had a weight to it that I wasn't sure how to pick up. With the women at the facilities, I said, not a question. Some of the women at the facilities, yes. And some have formed relationships with other retrieved males. And some have not formed relationships but have found purpose in the work. The initiative does not require any particular type of contribution from retrieved individuals. What it hopes for, what it was built hoping for, is willing participation. I stared at the floor for a moment, then I looked back up. When you say relationships, I mean what the word means. Connection. Partnership. In some cases in the full sense, in some cases less so. The initiative was not designed to enforce anything, but it was designed in the awareness that if human males become as rare as the models predict, and if the goal is preserving human genetic diversity and ultimately human population viability, then. She stopped. Then she typed something that felt like she was choosing words very carefully. Then the simplest and most ethically complete version of the path forward involves humans choosing to continue. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, and the 11 women in this facility, they were chosen for this specific facility, for me. A long pause. They were chosen for this facility. They were briefed on the mission. They know there would be a retrieved male here. They volunteered for this posting. They volunteered. Every one of them, yes. Chapter 5, Understanding What You Don't Want to Understand. I'm going to be honest with you, and I think this story only works if I am honest. If I don't clean it up and make it more heroic or more simple than it was, the next 2 weeks were not a time of clarity for me. They were not a time of settling in and finding my footing. They were a time of significant internal difficulty, in ways that I think anyone who has ever had their life completely restructured without their consent would understand. I wasn't treated badly, that's important to say. I was treated with consistent care and attention and patience. Dara checked on me every day. Siren was available whenever I needed her. The food, which came from a combination of stored human provisions and some Vale standard nutrition that I was slowly being introduced to, was adequate and often surprisingly good. The facility had spaces that were designed for physical activity, and I used them because physical movement has always been how I process things that are too large to sit still with. But I was, and I want to find the precise word for this, I was not at peace. There was a fundamental dissonance at the center of everything. The awareness that the life I'd had, the before, with its dirty hands and its dented thermos and its badly played guitar on Thursday evenings drifting through the wall, that life was gone. Not destroyed exactly. Not even necessarily forever. But gone in the practical, day-to-day sense that matters most. I was 200 meters underground in British Columbia, which sounded strange even to think, to invoke a human geography term for where I was. And above me, the world was continuing its complicated business of surviving and changing and being human, and I was not in it. And the 11 women of the facility were watching me be not at peace, with patience and with varying degrees of understanding, but watching. What made it more complicated, and here is where I need to just be straightforward about something, what made it more complicated was that they were not frightening. They should have been more frightening to me than they were. Everything rational in me should have been more afraid, more defended, more closed. Instead, from the very first day, there was something in the quality of the space they created around me that I found. And I'm going to use a word that surprises me even as I write it, restful. Not comfortable, not easy, but restful the way certain spaces are restful, the way old forests are restful. Reva ran what I came to understand as a morning physical training session in the activity space. And on day 4, I showed up not because anyone had invited me, but because I needed movement, and the activity space was where movement happened. She didn't acknowledge my arrival. She continued her workout, which was significantly more intense than anything I could match, a combination of structured movement disciplines that were only partly analogous to human martial practices. And I found an area that was mine, and I ran, or the facility's equivalent of running, on a surface that provided appropriate resistance. And we spent an hour in the same room doing our separate physical things without speaking, and it was the first hour since I'd woken up where my brain was quiet. At the end of it, when I was cooling down and she was finishing something that involved very precise, very powerful footwork, she looked over at me. She made a gesture, a specific movement of the chin that I was beginning to recognize as a nod equivalent. The Vale nod. I made my version of their nod back. She almost smiled. I was getting better at reading their expressions. The almost smile was real. Fen was the one who broke the language barrier first. Not Siren with the device, not the careful mediated communication through text. Fen, with her enormous energy and her perpetual forward lean of curiosity, had apparently decided that waiting for the translation device was taking too long. She started bringing me things. Objects from around the facility, holding them up and pointing at them and saying their name in her language, and then waiting, with an expression of barely contained excitement, for me to say the human language equivalent. It was the most elementary possible language learning exercise, the kind you do with a 2-year-old. And it was also, I realized after the first session, enormously effective for her purposes, which were not just vocabulary acquisition. She was learning my face, learning how my features moved when I was naming things versus when I was uncertain versus when I was making a joke. We spent a lot of time in those early weeks in this call-end response of object names. She was fast, faster than I'd have expected. Within a week, she had a vocabulary of about 150 human words, and was starting to combine them in 2-word constructions that made her so visibly pleased with herself that I started clapping when she got one right. And she immediately adopted clapping as a Fen-specific celebratory gesture, even though no one else in the facility did it. It is very hard to remain in a state of pure disoriented grief when someone is clapping at you because they correctly said water container in your language. I'm not saying that's the thing that saved me. I'm just saying it was one of the things. Assel asked me, through Siren at the end of the 2nd week, if I would be willing to be interviewed. Formally. She wanted to document my experience of retrieval and acclimation. Her research, apparently, included a longitudinal study of how retrieved humans experience the transition, and she was collecting accounts from all stations. I said yes. I said yes because I was raised to believe in the value of documentation, in the importance of making records of things so that knowledge can survive the individual. I said yes because the work of it felt like something to do, a shape to give to days that otherwise had no familiar scaffolding. And I said yes because Assel, when I gave my agreement, had a reaction I wasn't prepared for, a sudden stillness, then a very controlled but genuine emotional response that I read, even with my still imperfect understanding of her expressions, as something like gratitude. She'd been worried I'd say no. She'd been sitting with that worry, managing it professionally, and now it was resolved, and the resolution moved through her face before she could moderate it. I thought about that for a while afterward, about what it meant that she'd been worried, about the weight of the word volunteered that Siren had used when she'd told me about the women choosing this posting. They had all signed up for something uncertain, something they couldn't know the full shape of until I woke up. A retrieved human who might be damaged, hostile, unresponsive, afraid in ways that expressed as aggression. They'd signed up to be in a facility with that unknown thing and to do their professional work around it, and then I'd turned out to be, what? Cale Whitmore, who ran on a machine in the morning and learned vocabulary games with the enthusiastic young one and drank not quite right tea and cried quietly for 4 minutes and then went to sleep. They'd been waiting for me, and I'd turned out to be just a person. Maybe that was a relief for them. Maybe it was something else. Somewhere around day 23, I woke up and realized I'd been dreaming in fragments of Veil phonology. Not words I knew, not the vocabulary Fen and I had been building together, but sounds that were native to their language system, the specific spacing and cadence of it, appearing in my sleeping brain in the way that a new language does when it's starting to take root somewhere deeper than the conscious learning layer. I lay there in the facility's artificial morning light and listened to the remnants of those sounds dissolve, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something I recognized as curiosity rather than anxiety. Not peace, not acceptance, not any of the tidy emotional milestones that recovery narratives usually hit on a clear schedule. Just curiosity, the plain, forward-pointing quality of wondering what was going to happen next. That's something, I thought. That's something. Miv found me in the technical section of the facility, an area I'd started wandering into in the afternoons because it was the most active space, the one with the most visible function, the one where things were clearly and visibly happening. Miv spent most of her waking hours there, managing systems whose full purpose I was only beginning to map, and she'd established a pattern in my first weeks of ignoring me with a consistency that felt, in its own way, companionable. But this particular afternoon, she was sitting in front of a large display showing what looked like a three-dimensional map, topographical and subsurface data, pressure readings, something that was clearly geological. She was frowning at it with the specific quality of frown. That means the data is not doing what you expected. I stood behind her and looked at the display and said, "There's an aquifer anomaly in the southwest quadrant." She turned and looked at me. I pointed. "That pressure differential there between those two strata, that signature is consistent with an underground water source that's behaving unusually. Might be related to surface activity above. If you've had seismic events in that area recently, even minor ones, they can shift the permeability." I stopped, because Miv was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. The perpetual low-level concentration was still there, but now there was something layered over it, something that might have been surprise. From Miv, who seemed constitutionally opposed to visible reactions. She turned back to the display. She moved her hands across it in a sequence, pulled up what appeared to be a subsurface imaging layer, and the anomaly I'd pointed to became, in the new rendering, dramatically more visible. She stared at it. She cross-referenced something on a secondary panel, and then she said something in her language, a single short utterance that I was pretty sure, from context and tone, was either a confirmation or a profanity. She looked at me again. I said, "Soil science, Earth surface. I know what underground water does to the land above it." She studied me with that engineer's assessment. Then she moved to make space at her workstation, literally shifted her chair a quarter turn and made an opening that said, wordlessly but clearly, "Sit down, you're helping with this." So I sat down, And for the next 3 hours, Miv and I worked on the geological anomaly together, communicating through her extremely limited English vocabulary, my extremely limited Vale vocabulary. Fen's periodic appearance as an impromptu translator. She'd been in the corridor, monitoring our progress with thinly veiled delight, and a remarkable amount of pointing at screens and making gestures for water moving and ground pressure. By the end of it, we had a working model for the aquifer behavior, and Miv had adjusted several of the facility's deep anchor stabilizers to account for the potential shift. She made the veil nod at me when we finished. Then she added something, a second movement, a small additional inclination of the head that was deeper than the regular nod equivalent. I didn't know what it meant. I looked at Fen. Fen said with careful English, "That mean, respect, like," she pressed her hands together briefly, "from expert." Miv had called me an expert. I looked back at the display with its corrected model and thought, I am useful here. Even here, 200 meters underground, surrounded by beings from elsewhere, I am useful. That was the second thing, the second of the things. Chapter 7, the question RHEVA asked. Day 31. I was in the activity space, finishing the cool-down from my morning run, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, breathing through the last of the exertion, when Reva came in and didn't go to her usual training area. She came and sat across from me, on the floor, which was a thing I had never seen Reva do. Reva was not a floor sitter. Reva was a person who occupied space in a specific way that kept her upright and mobile and in an optimal response position. Sitting on the floor was, for Reva, a significant posture adjustment. She didn't have the translation device. She had her own device, different from Siren's smaller, clipped to the forearm of her suit. She pulled it free and held it so I could see the screen and typed something. The text appeared in English, more haltingly than Siren's. Siren's translations had the fluency of long practice. Reva's had the directness of someone who didn't do this often and wasn't going to soften anything by accident. I have a question you do not have to answer. Okay, I said. Before here, your life, what did you fight for? I looked at the text for a moment. It was an interesting question. Not a question I'd expected from Reva, who I'd read as more practically minded than philosophical, but maybe that was a wrong reading. Maybe the security specialist asking about what I fought for was exactly the right reading of Reva. I didn't fight, I said. I worked, I tried to fix things, I repaired land that'd been damaged, I made things better slowly. That's not fighting. She read my response through the device. I'd learned to speak slowly and clearly, and Siren had apparently trained the device to capture human speech for translation, and then typed back. Same thing, different scale. You resisted damage. You refused to let things die without trying. I hadn't thought about my work that way, the restoration work. I'd always thought of it as pragmatic, scientific, practical, the application of ecological knowledge to remediation problems. Not heroic, not resistance, just work that needed doing. I guessed, I said. Why are you asking? I am trying to understand why you are here. Why you specifically? The selection criteria are biological, but biology is not the whole of what a person is. I want to understand what kind of person came through. And she typed, you are someone who tries to fix what is broken, without being asked, without requiring a reason beyond that it is broken. I didn't know what to say to that. She typed one more thing. The thing we are trying to do in this initiative. It is also fixing something broken. I thought you should know I respect the parallel. She put her device back on her forearm, got up off the floor in one fluid motion, and went to her training area without looking back. I sat there with my back against the wall for a long time after she left, feeling something that I want to describe accurately. It wasn't pride. It wasn't comfort. It was more like being seen. In the specific, particular way of being seen by someone who doesn't see easily, who doesn't offer the recognition casually. Being seen by Reva felt like a serious thing, like it had cost her something to offer it, and she'd offered it anyway. Chapter 8, What Liar Showed Me. I've been building up to talking about Liar. She was the one I understood least in those first weeks, the one who kept the most careful distance, and I'd become aware of her through her absence more than her presence. Aware of the fact that while the others had been moving toward me in their various ways, Liar consistently found positions on the periphery. She wasn't avoidant in an unfriendly way. She was present. She attended the group meals that had started to happen after the first few weeks, in the larger common space, a meal that functioned as a gathering point even though we still couldn't all communicate directly. She was in the common areas, but she chose corners, edges, positions with full sightlines but maximum distance. On day 37, she came to my door in the corridor waiting way, like siren, and when I opened the door she held out something. It was a physical object. Paper, actual paper, though it wasn't quite paper, there was a quality to it that was slightly too smooth and slightly too uniform for cellulose fiber, but it was thin and flexible and had information on it. Human information. A hand-drawn map. I looked at it and then looked at her, and she made a gesture toward the corridor, indicating, "Follow me." I followed her. She took me through a passage I hadn't been down before, deeper into the facility, but then curving upward in a way that surprised me, and through two heavy sealed doors that she opened with a palm press, and then through a space that was clearly an equipment room of some kind, and then through a smaller door that required both her print and a code she entered on a panel. And then we were in a space I had never imagined was there. It was a vertical shaft, not enormous, maybe 8 meters in diameter, with a ladder structure running up the inside. And at the top, maybe 40 meters up, there was light. Not artificial light, not the cool blue-white of the facility. Real light, gray and diffuse and slightly moving, the way light through cloud cover moves. Daylight. She pointed up. I grabbed the ladder and started climbing. My arms and legs knew what to do before my brain had caught up with what was happening. I climbed fast, not thinking about why or what it was or whether it was safe, just climbing toward the light because after 37 days underground, my body was responding to daylight the way a plant responds to daylight, with something cellular and pre-rational and total. At the top, a hatch, I pushed it open. Cool air. Real air, air with weather in it, with the specific quality of altitude and forest. Damp from recent rain, the smell of soil and decaying leaves, and something mineral from rock. I pulled myself up and out and sat on the edge of the hatch in what appeared to be a natural rock outcropping. Trees around the perimeter. Sky above, overcast, gray-white, cloud-heavy British Columbia sky. Not bright, not dramatic, just real. I put my hands flat on the rock surface beside me. Rock, earth, the cold, rough, specific texture of it, a granite formation with lichen, small and precise and perfectly real. I stayed there for 45 minutes, not doing anything, not trying to run or look for a way down the mountain or assess the situation or plan. Just sitting with my hands on real rock and my face in real air and the gray sky doing its patient gray thing above. When I climbed back down, Liar was where I'd left her, sitting cross-legged on the equipment room floor, waiting. She had the map in her hand. She gave it to me. I looked at it again. The ladder, the hatch. Notes in what I now recognized as her handwriting in a mix of veil notation and carefully written English words, air, light, outside, anytime. She'd made me a map to the surface, made it before I arrived, left it for when I needed it. I folded it very carefully and put it in my pocket. I said her name, Liar. She looked at me. "Thank you," I said. She made the deep respect nod, the one Miv had given me in the technical room, not the regular, not equivalent, the deeper one. Then she got up and walked back the way we'd come, and I followed, and we didn't speak, and it was the most significant conversation I'd ever had.